right, well, Hope City, it is good to be with you guys. My name is Peter, and I'm the pastor here at Hope City. If we haven't met yet, I really would love to meet you outside afterwards, either out on the patio or out in the lobby, whatever it may be. Or even better, let's meet up for some coffee sometime this week. You can email me, peter@hopecitysrq.com. I very sincerely mean that. I love meeting people for coffee, especially good coffee. I don't know if you're like a coffee snob, maybe a little bit like me. We can find some good coffee. I'm looking at a friend of mine. He would say, well, what about ice cream? Can we just go meet at ice cream? And, so then we would meet at Big Olaf's. But hey, whatever you're up to, whatever place that you love the most, that's good. We celebrate that. Here at Hope City, we've got, several things like we just talked about. June 5th is a big day. I want you to mark this down. June 5th is going to be our summer kickoff happening here, right here at Bayside, because we're just loving, helping point kids towards a hope this summer, to hope in Jesus, but also partnering with you as parents as well as you guys are getting ready for summer. So don't miss out on that. But hey, if you are like new to Hope City and you're probably like, what is happening? Like, why are you meeting at night? And why are you in like a different church's church? And so what's happening right now is Hope City is in the middle of a building process, and we are actually moving. We're going to be moving to Bee Ridge and McIntosh. There's a building over there, part of Palm Plaza. If you've ever had Firehouse Subs, it's right there on the corner. Hope City Church will be moving into that place permanently when we get that all built out and ready for you and your friends, and we cannot wait for that day. And in between, we are meeting on Sunday mornings. We're streaming live we have what we call a studio audience over at Hope City Studio, right off of Palmer Boulevard by Detweiler's. And then, of course, once a month, we're back here at Bayside. We love this. We're grateful for Pastor Randy and his generosity as they allow us to meet here on Sunday evenings. But I talked about ice cream, I talked about coffee. I'm wondering what other things I can kind of tweak. Maybe pizza. Like, what's your favorite pizza place locally? We could get kind of all amped up about that stuff. But hey, listen, last week we mentioned the fact that we all have different opinions on certain things. And one of the things that we're very opinionated on is, what does it mean to be successful? Or what does it look like for you to be successful? What does it look like for me to be successful? Well, we've dived into a series called The Success Equation. And last week I preached a message that I called The Price of Success. And we determined that actually some of the things that we have been chasing after to be successful were very costly to us as individuals, very costly to us. Like, how many of you grew up, you don't need to raise your hands because maybe your parents are in the room, or you don't want to, but how many of you grew up thinking that success meant good grades plus getting into a good college and earning a high-paying job would mean that you were successful in life? Some of you are chasing after that right now, like you're still living for that. Or maybe, for you, we talked about this last week, that maybe it was a nice car and living in the right zip code, and you have the best social status, therefore you are successful. No matter how you define success, whatever pieces you plug into that equation, it's critical, because the way that you define success defines you. You will start working towards things and for things based upon how you score yourself. How do I know if I'm doing a good job? Well, we start scoring ourselves based on all these things. So much of what you pursue and how you pursue it depends on what you deem as being successful. Last week, we talked about how some of those things that we chase after, that actually Jesus flips on its head and rearranges. And I'll be honest with you, it might even push up against, some of your expectations. I said to Tiffany last week, I was like, I'm actually not looking forward to preaching this message. I think it's not one that people are really going to be excited about hearing. How do you be successful? Well, give up your pride. Well, who wants to do that, right? Who wants to take on humility? And yet, this is what we learned from Jesus. See, nothing really rearranges your ideas of success quite like Jesus does. And tonight, we want to continue in that series, continue in how do we learn to be successful and measure success the way that Jesus does. See, last week we talked about 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17. I just want to flash that up on the screen for you because Jesus says, 1 John, we see these words here where it says, don't love the world or anything of the world. because the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And the world and its desires pass away. But the man who does the will of God lives forever. In essence, what we said was that there were the big three things that we chase after in life. And he says the lust of the flesh, the lust of the world, and the pride of life. And we boiled it down. We said it this way. We chase after passion, we chase after possession, and we chase after position. And if those big three lead to counterfeit success or poor formulas of success equations, well, then what does real success look like? And if you're going to break it down to what does Jesus say success is and how do we become successful, we've kind of flipped the script. And for the next 3 weeks, we want to talk about these three components from Christ. And he says faithfulness, fruitfulness, and fulfillment. And so tonight, we're going to dive into the topic of what does it mean to be faithful? Tiffany's going to be preaching next week on Mother's Day on fruitfulness. Yeah, I know. Get excited about that. You need to go to be a part of the Hope City studio next Sunday morning to hear that live. But if you're getting ready for success, you might want to just set your aim at straight Fs, okay? Like think freshman year of college, that kind of Fs, like straight Fs. Faithfulness, fruitfulness, and fulfillment. Because that's what it's going to take in order to be successful according to Jesus. This whole idea of like last shall be first, that kind of thing. And so tonight, we want to define what does it mean to actually be faithful? See, faithfulness, if you just boil it down, faithfulness is really just being trustworthy or dependable. Like, I don't know what pictures come to mind when I say the word faithful in your mind, but all week long, I kid you not, as I was preparing for this, I'm like, this is what I think of. I think of this dog right here, of Lassie. Anybody remember this show, Lassie? Yeah. What was the whole premise of the show? Timmy gets into trouble. Right? Like Timmy falls in a well. What happens? Lassie, go get help, right? Like, and off runs the dog. You know, Timmy, like he trips and breaks his ankle. Go get help. And Lassie runs off. The picture of faithfulness is that Lassie was always there for this guy, Timmy. Like, it's just, I don't know why, but that's what I think of. The kid was always in trouble. Lassie gets him out. Or maybe some of you are thinking about, faithfulness is that friend that you had in high school or college, and you're like, they were by my side through thick and thin. And others of you are like, yeah, I didn't have that experience. Like, that is the opposite when I think of my friends from high school. But the Old Testament book of wisdom, or the book of Proverbs, says it this way about faithfulness. It says, a faithful person will be richly blessed, but one eager to get rich will not go unpunished. In other words, if you chase after faithfulness, you will be richly blessed as well. But chase after riches, and you'll have neither, according to Proverbs. But later in the New Testament, this is played out in more detail. In fact, for you and for me, if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 25. And here in the story, we find Jesus. He's with his disciples, and so those are his friends, the 12 guys that he hung out with a lot. And he's near the end of his earthly ministry, his time here on earth. And Jesus is describing to these guys how he's going to leave earth and how he's going to go back to the Father in heaven. And he begins to describe what heaven is like and how he's going to come back later on. And so his disciples are getting a little tweaked because they're like, wait a second, how could you leave us? And like, what's going on here? Like all this kind of stuff. They've got lots of questions. And yet Jesus tells them this story. Because they're like, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? What do we do, Jesus? How are we supposed to live? And Jesus leans in, and in verse 14 of Matthew 25, he says it like this. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to their ability. So talents is like, the way that we would say like $1, $2, $5, $10. This is that idea. They have 5 talents or 5 units of money. Then he went on his journey. Verse 16, the man who received the 5 talents went at once, put his money to work, and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. But the one who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. And after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Well, the man with 2 talents came. "Master," you said, "you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more." His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Now, I want to pause here because this is the interesting part to me, right? I want to make sure that you don't miss this because it would be so easy to just fly by this. Notice both servants actually received the same exact reward. One produced 5, like way more than the other one. The other one produced, another 2. But what happens? They each received a reward for their faithfulness. See, the master wasn't concerned with the outcome. He was concerned with their faithfulness, not the sum totals. In other words, it didn't matter whether they started out or ended up with more or less. None of that was their concern. The concern was, what did they do with what they were given? See, here's the idea. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down, because faithfulness stays future focused. Faithfulness refuses to play a comparison game. It refuses. It's not about what's happening in the immediate moment. Faithfulness isn't concerned with what's happening today, right now. It's about what's going to be happening later. Faithfulness holds a higher vantage point, a viewpoint that looks out way beyond today and tomorrow and the next day. Faithfulness looks beyond that to what could be. And you're not compared to anyone else according to this story. Jesus isn't comparing him to other people. That might be on you. That might be on me. See, last time I checked, Jesus says it was the master's money, not yours or mine to begin with. And the master gave each according to their ability. But the master, he knew what was best. Again, it's not my business. But what is my business is what I do with what has been entrusted to me. How faithful will I be with little or much, whatever has been given to me? And there is so much in your life that is out of control. We think we are wildly in control of our lives, and yet we would find that we're not. You can't control the specific outcomes of situations. You can't control your spouse. You can't control the stock market. You can't control your neighbors. You can't control politics. But we are in control of one thing. We are in control of what we do with what we've been entrusted with how faithful we are to something. And I want you to hear me say this so clearly. If you choose to be faithful to your spouse, that's a decision. If you choose to be faithful to your job, that's a decision. If you choose to be faithful to God, that is a decision. And here's what I know. I know that there are plenty of opportunities for you to focus on what everybody else is doing. To focus on, what everybody else is achieving or their success and to chase after their focus. But in this decision to choose to be faithful, I'm not worried about your focus. I'm worried about my own focus. What does God have in front of me? And I continue to stay faithful because of my focus. When I was a younger man, when I was a youth pastor, I found myself, I was young in my craft, what I was doing as a pastor, and I lived in people's shadows for years. I lived in the shadow of other people. Here's the interesting part, though, is I'm the one that put myself in their shadow. Nobody else. I did. I compared myself to them. And I made choices based upon these people that I'm talking about. I wanted to preach like certain people. And so I would dress like they did, or I would talk like they would, or I would say turns of phrase like they did, or I found myself kind of envious of their giftings and their talents. How come I couldn't use less amount of words to have a greater point? And everybody else in the room was like, amen. How come you can't do that? And I just haven't happened yet, okay? But here's the deal. Here's what I'm getting at. I would try and shape myself and my calling to be more like these other guys, these other pastors. And it was easy for me to stop being faithful to what God had put right in front of me, to stop being Peter. Like, I've been doing this for 20 years now, and the first 20 haven't been, like, amazing. But I have determined, thank you, like 5 of you got it. I have determined that I'm just going to be me. I have determined that this is the way that God made me, and I'm going to just be faithful to who he made me to be. See, this is what I got at. When I looked at these other guys, like, you would say, well, that's good to have role models. But I had moved them to a different place. They weren't role models anymore. Like, I was trying to chase after their gifts, their gifting, their abilities. See, I don't study pastors anymore the way I used to. I used to study and be like, how did they, like, what are they wearing? Like, what are they dressing like nowadays? And what are they saying? Are they using the word turnt? Like, can I use that word? Like, or is that too, like, much of a high school term? Like, I don't know. Like, and I would start thinking about all that stuff, like their giftings. I'm not concerned with their giftings anymore. I'm concerned with their character. Because I want to remain faithful to the calling that God has placed here for me in my life to Hope City Church. And that's based on character. And so for you, I don't know where this applies in your world, but I know that it's so easy to compare yourself to other people in your industry, or other marriages, or like moms. Can we be real? Other mothers on play dates, like, how they buckle themselves? What? Like, they're like brilliant, right? And we're tempted to shift our focus from what God has called you to. And we're like, well, yeah, but I want to be like them. I want to do what they're doing. That looks way more fun than what I'm doing. Moms, can I tell you something? That God did not make a mistake when he gave you your kids. That is your child that God gave to you. He didn't make this like cosmic switch in the heavens, like, whoops, that one was supposed to go over there, but it's too late now, so I guess it's going to be like, all right, No, faithfully pour into your kids, regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the circumstances. You may not see, the results of that for years to come, but stay faithful. Stay faithful to it. Dads, the same thing is true for you. Stay faithful to what God has called you to. When you show up tomorrow to work, wherever it is that you work, you have an opportunity to choose to be faithful to your boss, to your supervisor, to your company, to your job. Or you can just kind of figure out what the sum average is of everybody else and just either be just above it or just below it. And yet, what if you were to be faithful to a faithful employee? See, what God has called you to, remain faithful to. So remember in Jesus' story, early on, the servant gave one servant 5, and they returned with 10, and he gave one 2, he returned with 4. And they both heard, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful. See, worldly success trains you to think, well, bigger is better. More is better. And we're gonna see that if I can go better, bigger, faster than everyone else, then I too will be more successful. And yet, 1 John, what does it say? The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. I just read an article this week about the stock market and about the investment approach of FANG and the different things that you should be investing in. This was like 15 years ago. They said, you can't lose if you invest in Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, right? Like Amazon. And they just said this week, yeah, we might think a little bit differently about that now. Like there's something that we said we were so sure on that you could bet your entire retirement on this. And yet we see it coming to pass in 1 John 2. The world and its desires pass away. Netflix just posted their first loss in subscriptions, like astronomically, in this last quarter. Who would have thought, right? Like who would think these things? You think it's always up and to the right. And yet some things, they come and they go. Stay faithful to the thing that is most important, what God has for you. In Matthew 25, Jesus is saying, no. Don't even worry about what others are doing. Don't worry about those guys. Let's just talk about you. What do you have? What are you doing? Which means that we need to ask this question of ourselves. What are you doing with what God has given me? What am I doing with what God has given me? And am I being faithful to it? Am I staying faithful to it? Are you staying focused on the gifts, the things that God has given you? And true success starts there, because I'm convinced that in this equation of success, that faithfulness is a multiplier. That when you add faithfulness into the mix of what God has called you to, that it is a multiplier. I'm looking at a couple teachers in the room who've been teaching for a pile of years. They started really young, okay? What they're experiencing now is because of the years and years and years of investment that they've made into teaching. It's true for many different careers, that you spend time in that space, in that world. Your faithfulness to that, you might not see results for a long time from now, but you just can't quit before you see those results. Like, just don't quit. Faithfulness says, no, I'm going to keep my eyes on the future. I'm going to stay future focused. And yet there was one guy in this story from Jesus that should caution us. In verse 24, it says, the man who had received 1 talent, he came and he said, Master, he goes, I knew that you're a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your talent in the ground. And see, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. At least get me interest, right? That's what he's saying. Two very different outcomes. But why? See, here's what we know. That the last servant thought he knew the master, thought that he knew what the master would want, that it would be best to just bring back the one after, however long it was that you've been gone. Look, I didn't lose it. It's still here. But he thought he knew him. He was afraid of the master. And I've been challenged by this quote by A.W. Tozer. It says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Let me say that again, because that's a lot to just chew on there. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Because here's what that means. Here's how this plays out. Whatever you think about God ultimately determines how you live. For instance, if you think about God the way that I thought about my old high school band director, he was ex-Marine, and it was if you made a mistake, it was do 10 push-ups right now. And so what did you do? I lived in fear. I was I can't do any more push-ups. This is ridiculous. I'm just unable to do this. He was hard, intimidating man, right? And so I just kind of kept my eye on him and trying to do the best I could. I was afraid. Or maybe what image comes to mind when you think about God? Do you think about him like he's a judge, like this old man in the sky that just can't wait to just rap his gavel and tell you what you've done wrong? Or maybe God is a harsh father. Or he's a principal waiting with a detention slip. Or maybe you see God a little bit differently. He's like a weak shepherd with a sheep on his shoulders. And you're like, what gives? I can't follow him. Or maybe you see God as a warrior, like Brad Pitt style, kind of I couldn't possibly relate to that. See, this passage challenges us to think a new thought. That faithfulness is not concerned with obedience, it's concerned with obedience, not outcomes. What if faithfulness was more than just getting to the end result? What if faithfulness to God was more than just an obligation of all the things that you should do? And what if it actually was driven out of love? See, faithfulness can be concerned with obedience and not outcomes, because faithfulness, it trusts God with the results. It trusts God with the outcomes. He said, I'm going to do what you've called me to do. I'm just going to be faithful, and you're going to leave the outcomes to God. See, I wonder what love has caused you to do. What things have you done for another person out of love? When I think about my kids and the love that I have for my son and my 2 daughters, it's just, there isn't anything I wouldn't do for them. I would give up my time, I'd give up my energy, I give up my resources for my kids. I mean, what has love caused you to do? But what has love for God caused you to do? When you think about, how God has loved you and cared for you and provided for you, what does that lead you to do? Because faithfulness is not about the outcomes. It's about obedience. When I look at guys in the Bible or people in the Bible, I think about Daniel. Daniel was faithful in some small things. He just was faithful in prayer when prayer was illegal and unpopular. David was faithful in shepherding sheep long before he ever became a king of a nation. Samuel faithfully served in the house of the Lord as a young boy all the way up until he was an adult before he was put in charge. Or 3 Hebrew boys that just refused to bow down before a statue, and they were thrown into a fiery furnace for their faithfulness, only to walk out of it. Paul was faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ, even though it would cost him his life. And Timothy was faithful to the church and loved it and cared for it and pastored it. Now there's so many more people whose small things done faithfully bring big results. Don't underestimate your faithfulness. Don't underestimate what God can do with your faithfulness. And I want you to think about this. If you're on the verge of giving up on being faithful, if you're just like right there at the edge of saying, you know what, I've done it, I'm just not seeing the results. Who cares, right? Listen to me. Do you know who nobody talks about? The guy who almost invented the light bulb. Nobody thinks about that guy. But the one that stayed faithful through failed attempts over and over and over again. Who else we talk about? We don't talk about Steve Jobs' early days in the garage because the garage was incredible and man, it was so high tech and it was just beautiful. No, they talk about Steve Jobs in the garage because guess what? It produced something 20 years later, however many years later, that the world is still kind of wrapping its mind around. And if you are on the edge of giving up on faithfulness, whether that's faithfulness in your marriage, faithfulness to your kids, faithfulness to your job, faithfulness to the Lord, I just want to tell you, don't quit. Don't stop being faithful to the thing that God has put in front of you or that he has called you to, because you have no idea the results that might happen a season or 2 from now. Think about your kids. Think about the legacy that you lead. See, don't give up on them because you're not seeing the results that you want. There are quick solutions to each one of these areas, though, right? I mean, you could give up on your marriage and you could choose to run off with an old high school flame. Sure. But that's not faithfulness. You are not advancing in your career, just jump on LinkedIn. Bounce from town to town, right? Like, don't ever put down roots. Don't ever get meaningful relationships because you're just moving from place to place to place. Your kids are a hot mess, right? Just stick an iPad in front of them. Give up on parenting and just kind of phone it in from here on out. Maybe you're tempted to give up on God because you know what? You haven't heard him in a while. You haven't seen him in a while. You're saying, yeah, Peter, I just don't know. Like, you don't know how it feels. I'd say, no, I've been there. I've been in places where I'm like, it would just be easier to give up. But faithfulness causes you to hang on. I love how Hebrews 10:23 says this. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who is promised is faithful. I love that word, unswervingly. You've seen those people on the road that are driving with their knees because they're doing like a TikTok video or something, and you're like, what? They're all over the place. That's the idea, is like, let us hold unswervingly. We keep our eyes dead set on what God has called us to, and we're not swerving to the left, to the right. We're not moving off of the mark because we know that we're going to hold on. Psalm 27 verse 8 says, my heart says of you, seek his face. And your face, Lord, I will seek. And I can't think of anything, any person that was more faithful than the person of Jesus. See, tonight we want to give you an opportunity to seek his face. You know, in your unfaithfulness or in your, struggle to be faithful, we have an opportunity tonight to just seek God's face through communion. See, communion is an opportunity for you to receive the elements. There's a little wafer, and then there's a little, juice, a little piece of juice there. And those two things remind us of what Jesus did on the cross for us, that his body was broken for us. That's the wafer. That his blood was poured out for us. That's the juice, so that you and I could be made right with God. We could be forgiven. And tonight, I'm just wondering, could God simply be asking you to remain faithful? To just hang on, to stay faithful. See, what is God inviting you to? And how will you respond to him? God, tonight I'm just praying for each person in this space, Lord, for myself, for each person that's, listening online, that's tuning in online. God, we want to be people that are faithful. We want to have that be a part of our success equation. But God, we admit that there are so many times it's just easier to phone it in. It's easier to give up, to throw our hands up and God, to just give up on being faithful. But Lord, I pray that you would give us courage. You would give us stamina. I pray, Lord, that you would give us eyes to see what only you can do. God, I pray that we would have the mindset that just says, it's not about the outcomes, it's about my obedience. Father, help us to be people, men and women, students that are faithful to you. God, we love you. We're grateful for you. We pray all these things in Jesus' name.